Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for joining the ninth session of the Sustainability Insight. Firstly, I'd like to introduce our organizing team from UNESCO Jakarta. My name is Sachi Suzuki, JFIT coordinator. And here we have Vidyani Ahmad, Gani Mulia, and Chipta Sanda. The title of today's webinar is Evidence-Based for Environmental Justice and Sustainability. The moderator is Professor Shahbaz Khan, the Director of UNESCO Regional Science Bureau for Asia and the Pacific, and the guest speakers are Professor Donna Craig, Western Sydney University, Australia, and Professor Roman Jashenko, Director General of Institute of Zoology and Chairman of the MAB National Committee, Kazakhstan. We are ready to take your questions through the Q&A box and the Facebook page. You are invited to fill the attendance form, which we are going to share during the webinar if you wish to receive the certificate. That's all from my side. The Professor Shahbaz, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sachi. This is a wonderful day. We have two very eminent colleagues and friends of UNESCO and friends of environment with us. So we will begin first with Professor Donna Craig, who is a specialist in many aspects of law. And in fact, I'm one of her students almost more than 15 years ago when she started Masters in International Environmental Law at the Macquarie University. And I also fondly remember her partner, Michael Jeffrey. Both of them have made a big impact on environmental law in Australia and in Canada. So we will be discussing today a special insight into sustainability from the angle of what kind of evidence is needed, and at the same time, how do we strengthen the laws and their implementation at different levels. And we will be discussing in the context of UNESCO sites and some of the work which has been done by Professor Donna and Professor Roman Jashenko. So those aspects will come forward. Dear colleagues, we are live on the Facebook through Sustainability Insight, but also from our office in Jakarta. And we have several colleagues who will join directly in this Zoom session. Feel free to ask any questions. The format of the questions is the same. You ask the questions through chat box, through Facebook Live, or you ask these questions directly to the panelists here. And we will consider those questions carefully, and there would be customized replies following the session on our Sustainability Insight page. So Professor Donna, if I can begin first with you. And thank you very much for your generous time availability to come here today. This context of environmental justice is a very special one. And I would like you to give us an idea, what does this really mean? Is it the justice for only the environment? Where does the economy and people come in? And what is the role of law? And how do we bring it into the concept of sustainability? Professor Donna.
I told you your questions were too large. But this is a wonderful opportunity. Thank you. I've been involved in environmental law ever since I was practically a child. That's why I'm not grayer. And my theme has always been the importance of people and human rights, and particularly Indigenous rights, as well as concern for preserving the environment and ecosystems. Environmental justice has, in some ways, been the very origins of the environmental movement, because it arose out of a concern that there was a deep-seated inequity in how environment was valued in decisions. And so the early move towards pollution control, environmental impact assessment, involved trying to rectify an imbalance in society. At the same time, from the 1960s and in many other places around the world, often into the 1970s and 80s, there was an increased concern about social inequities, and the importance of the democracy movement to environmental decision making. And that really culminated in the Aarhus Convention and the basic tenets of modern environmental law around the right to participate in environmental decisions, have environmental values properly taken into account, and to give people a remedy. So in many ways, what we've seen is environmental values being inserted into decision making from very much a position of inequality not only in terms of how those values were considered, but an inequality about the impacts of the worst instances of pollution, toxic waste dumps, the pollution of rivers, the pollution caused by contaminated soils, which in many cases were minority communities, Indigenous communities, communities of colour, working people who had no resources or remedies. So in a way, and the environmental justice concern has always been a part of environmental law, and it certainly informed the Brundtland Report, the Rio Declaration, the Johannesburg Summit, and everything that followed. I think the really interesting thing about environmental justice is it was primarily an issue like affirmative action. They wanted equality of access and equality of environmental values along with economic values and other values, a bit like affirmative action. So it was in some ways reactive and it was in some ways defensive. How do you give people a voice who don't have a voice? How do you make socially vulnerable people more powerful? However, if you think of environmental justice and contemporary approaches to sustainability, it is actually something a little bit different. Maybe those things are the foundation, but if we're talking about environmental justice in the modern context, it's about transformational justice. One of the sad things about our efforts at sustainability over the last 30 years has been by injecting these concerns and processes and information and science into the decision making has not fundamentally transformed the nature of our economies and the degradation of the environment. So the modern discourse around environmental justice is how do you build on these foundations to empower communities to bring about transformative sustainable development.
Really
and that's where I think our discussion gets too large.
No, this is really wonderful. It's very good to give the evolution and where we are in the process. You also use the term just sustainability. So maybe we will be able to explore it further as we go. And it's very clear, Professor Donna, it's about people and their participation in the processes and listening to those who have not been listened. And environment also is not listened properly, but we need to continue to empower people to be able to play their just role into the environmental sustainability, social sustainability, economic sustainability. Let's take one step further. Indigenous people are very important people wherever they are in the world. They are the people who are the owners of that part of the land and the water and the resources. So how do we bring indigenous aspects into this environmental justice? And you have done a lot of work in desert with the Cooperative Research Center there as well. And this is a key area of specialization for you. Give us some insights from your work in Australia and what can we learn from there for whole Asia Pacific.
It's a very humbling area to work in. To give you an example of the different worldviews with Indigenous peoples, Aboriginal people that I worked with do not distinguish between past, present and future. And the animate and the inanimate. So therefore a rock and a tree or a river have the same value in many ways as human beings. Animals, you know, similarly have these qualities. So one of the difficulties in terms of working with Indigenous communities is to depart from the Western mindset. And I think the most wonderful expression of Indigenous values was working with Aboriginal people in the Kimberley region of Western Australia, where they say the past is always before you. So you have to understand the past, you have to learn from the past, and you have to think about future generations. So they are an example of what we would like to do with sustainability. They also integrate these social, ecologic and economic dimensions in a way that our Western civilization has not done, and which sustainability recommends that we do. So while we cannot become Indigenous, they become a living and breathing example of how a human society can do that. And I think it's very important to biosphere reserves because I know Professor Shahbaz always says they are experiments, they are examples of sustainability. They show that it can be done, how it can be done. We can look at the science around it. We can look at how we can embed and enable and empower communities through it. So in that way, I think Indigenous knowledge is fundamental. Now, Indigenous property rights can be very important defensively to protect Indigenous knowledge, but the Western idea and the legal idea of intellectual and cultural property rights can be useful defensively. But if we want a continuation of Indigenous knowledge as part of ecosystem services, Indigenous livelihoods, protecting Indigenous cultures, we need to understand that it's deeply embedded in that society, their institutions, customary laws, and their relationship to land, seas and waters. So unless we protect Aboriginal country, we cannot protect Indigenous knowledge, and we will lose these invaluable examples of living sustainability.
That's a very good insight, and especially many colleagues would not know this concept of time, the past, present, and future is not really that known to the Indigenous people, and the Western way, or I would say the modern way of thinking many of the things may not be well aligned with the Indigenous knowledge, which is very important. And one of the examples is the recent bushfires, unfortunately, which happened. And we may not have used the right kind of Indigenous knowledge there. So let's explore further a concept which is very dear to UNESCO, is the Biosphere Reserves concept. So under the Biosphere Reserves, Professor Donna, you know, we have a protected area, then we have a buffer area around it, and there is a transitional area. To be able to enforce those boundaries, there has to be local and provincial and national laws. And many times those laws are conflicting. Harmonization of those laws is very, very important. There may be activities which can be undertaken in the transition zone, but nothing can be taken into the core zone. So like, for example, mining should not happen into the main core zone. So you have done a very important piece of work for UNESCO, looking into biosphere reserves and how do we harmonize different laws and their enforcement. So can you please now bring us into that understanding that why these laws conflict, how do we harmonize them, and how do we actually enforce those laws? Is there some real guidance for the international bodies like UNESCO, which we can learn from your work?
Thank you. It was a great study to be involved in. The modern approach to the concept of biosphere reserves and their governance is very much in accordance with the best practice around sustainability. I think we can incorporate the basic legal and policy principles about sustainability in almost every governance structure. So things like the precautionary principle, the polluter pays, the importance of environmental information, participation. I don't think that's and many of these principles are rapidly part of treaties and becoming customary law. So I think that it's not necessary to say that a principle has to be overtly recognised in every national law for it to have some political power and some legal power. Basic human rights principles around the right to life don't have to constantly be repeated. So I think we can build on those basic principles of sustainability in particularly how we designate and govern biosphere reserves. I think we've done very well in many ways in designating and harmonising our protected areas. And I think that's partly because of the work of UNESCO, but also of other organisations like IUCN that have set up global guidelines for the classification and management of protected areas. And increasingly, this is impinging on biosphere reserves because there's a realisation that protected areas can't be islands. And we'll see this with Professor Jashenko's work, particularly on transboundary protected areas. And developing protected area corridors for animal and plant species. So in Australia, we're trying to develop connected protected areas right across arid land ecosystems, coastal ecosystems. And what we're doing is using multiple classifications: forestry reserves, Indigenous protected areas, the conventional national parks, buffer zones, private land that is predominantly managed with environmental covenants. So there's a move to develop the understanding of protected areas by providing this greater connectivity, which brings it much closer in alignment with what we're trying to do with biosphere reserves. What we found in our studies is most national parks now have reasonably strong legal and management frameworks. However, even though most countries we studied had adopted and declared biosphere reserves, sometimes from quite early on, sometimes pre the Seville principles, prior to 1995, they had never really tried to develop a uniform law or an overarching or a special law that aligned the protected area initiatives and these other conservation initiatives with their biosphere reserves. So in Australia, we've had principles that should be incorporated in the management of biosphere reserves as part of our national law. However, it says very little about what a biosphere reserve is, how you designate a biosphere reserve, and exactly what the process is for incorporating those principles into the management plan, and how long it takes to prepare one and when they should be reviewed, and then how that then links to the international framework. So the international principles are fundamentally important. They're clearly behind the broad adoption of biosphere reserves, but to a great extent, their legal enforceability requires the development of national framework laws. And to a great extent, we've discovered they don't really exist. Mm. So my idea would be, and this is strictly speaking for myself, is that we need biosphere reserves in the modern view, as we've developed it through the World Network, as an overarching framework with our other environmental laws and designations, such as our protected area laws, our planning laws, where there's areas of high conservation value, as sitting below it in the pyramid. We need ways of coordinating the different layers in that pyramid and the institutions in that pyramid. And we need clear legal principles about what to do in cases of conflict and how to avoid conflict. And I don't think that is impossibly difficult. It's simply that it has not been a priority.
Well, that's where maybe one of the things we need to do is to educate people about, first of all, these principles. which you have mentioned, like the polluter pays principle, precautionary principle, the zonation principles coming from the MAPS work and the MAP International Coordinating Committee, and all the scientists and lawyers need to work together. That's where I'm also very pleased to note that you have the IUCN Academy of Environmental Law Distinguished Education Award in 2017. And you also have, with the ADB, published a very important book, which I would like people to read, is about building capacity in the environmental law. So there are those kind of efforts. Can you please, Professor Donna, guide us if we have to go and educate people about understanding of these principles, and then how do we bring them into our law and its implementation? Where should we start?
Okay. I think we start really with the Brundtland report, the Bio Declaration and Agenda 21. I think that it's a powerful articulation of the kind of world we want, and how, what kind of principles could underpin that. Then most of those approaches are now being, and through the Convention on Biological Diversity particularly, and the World Heritage Convention, most of those approaches have been translated into national action plans. And that's where things tend to become very ad hoc and fragmented.
Yeah.
I think that's, if we could get a consistent set of principles across those fragmented pieces of legislation, and those principles became the basis for decision-making and conflict resolution, that would be a first step. What I say in my answer to your questions is dealing with conflict isn't all that hard. If we have really good governance processes, we'll reduce conflict. For example, if you have good participation, you have really good engagement in decision-making. If you have grievance mechanisms, as the ADB, the World Bank, and a number of other organisations have. We have a conflict of laws approach whereby you can have multiple legal systems coexisting and recognising each other. Yeah. We've got long established private international law and how to do that. It's a lot harder to work out how we are innovative, creative, and we harmonise international, national and local legal frameworks. I tried to give an example of how that could be done. In Victoria, in one of our provinces in Australia, what they tried to do many years ago was create what they called a Flora and Fauna guarantee, and that is, it was a bit like endangered species legislation. You had to gather together all the information and the designation of your various species and ecosystems, and that became the scientific or evidence base for the top of that pyramid. And they were the values that were to inform all of the natural resource laws and management plans that, that followed it in that state. If we tried to do that in terms of our biosphere reserves and connected it to the national biodiversity plans, protected area plans, I think we would go a long way to developing that integrated framework. We have some examples of where this has been done legally. One is integrated catchment management. The other is integrated coastal zone management. And the primary mechanism of integration is enabling people and communities and giving them equity in access to information and benefit sharing. Well, so you create a political movement for this kind of approach.
That's a very good example. So let's go a little bit more into the governance system. The court itself has a very important role in implementation of law and making sure all the rights are properly recognized and we are interpreting the laws in the right ways. You have been working with judges from Bangladesh, dear Donna. What advice can you give in terms of building capacity? Those judges are not necessarily environmentalists or they are not specializing into environmental law. How do we build their capacity, and nations who are struggling with all these issues of sustainable development? How we start empowering those people by giving them the right knowledge so that they can make the right decisions?
They have an enormous caseload, apart from anything. If you look at, say, even their family law jurisdiction, and particularly the Supreme Court of Brazil is another example, their caseload is massive. If you're going to have science-informed, evidence-based decision-making, you have to take time. So in a way, you've got to choose the battles that come before the courts. There are some wonderful capacity building programs. The Asia Development Bank and IUCN have run capacity building programs throughout the Asia Pacific region. They're still doing that when travel becomes possible. Again, there are some wonderful teaching materials on the ADB website. There are some fantastic teaching modules on the IUCN Protected Area website. So there are some great resources which can be used. The Academy of IUCN Academy of Environmental Law also has some courses and excellent resource material on their website. I think the starting point needs to be, though, is what are our objectives? What do we want? What unites us rather than divides us? And it was interesting, in a number of the national laws, what a biosphere reserve was whatever the World Network designates to be a biosphere reserve. Well, we're not going to be able to develop that integrated democratic participatory response unless each nation decides what they value, how they're going to value it and what instruments they're going to use. So I think, we've become a little bit complacent in the environment movement. We need to go back to our first steps and revisit this idea of what our objectives and values are, because at the end of the day, lawyers are really instrumentalists. It's our role to design something which will reflect those values and try and create checks and balances and resources.
Let me put a tricky question to you, Donna. How long it will take a judge who has not been dealing with environmental challenges to be trained into making the right kind of decisions with proper understanding of the environmental principles?
Well, judges are remarkable.
How long it takes?
I think they can do it in a matter of months, because judges constantly adjudicate on expert evidence. So if I'm looking at a geotechnical report, and you'd be aware of a lot of these issues, I'm not an engineer. However, I often have to look at things like that as part of an environmental assessment. A geotechnical expert or a water expert can be giving evidence in the Land Environment Court. In order to determine the importance of that evidence and make a decision, I do not have to be an engineer. You simply have to have good experts, a good expert panel who can communicate what their expertise means in terms of that decision-making. Similarly with conflict of laws, I don't have to be an expert in Danish law to work out whether or not Australia should recognise a Danish marriage. I simply have to say, is it comparable, and what will be the impact on our concepts of marriage in Australia? So judges are good at dealing with expert evidence, but they do need time. It does involve resources. You can't have partisan experts, so very often it means funding intervener groups, conservation groups, tribal peoples. That's a crucial part of it, and my late husband pioneered many of those mechanisms.
Michael did many of those areas,
Now, the other approach is the IUCN and their ECOLEX framework, and also through the Law Commission, has created a judges portal. So, for example, if there's a Pakistani judge or Pacific Island judge have a particular issue, they can go onto a confidential portal and look at how other judges in other jurisdictions have adjudicated that matter. And Professor Brian Preston, UNEP, IUCN have done a great deal in providing those resources. So if if the judge is open-minded, they're good at dealing with that kind of expert technical evidence, if they have a willingness to learn, and often they're halfway there. If they've been a human rights lawyer or an international lawyer, these concepts are not revolutionary in many ways. They're an extension of those existing fields. So many of the human rights approaches will resonate, and therefore they, or their interpretation of environmental provisions in constitutions, of which there are many now, can be the basis on which they can build their decision making. And ironically, most of the constitutional provisions and the really radical judicial decisions on the environment are coming out of developing countries. They're not coming out of countries like mine.
Yeah, and because maybe they started later, so they can have a better understanding in the process of making those laws. Let's turn our attention, Donna, to the present unfortunate COVID situation. There is another principle which is very important, is the payment for environmental or ecosystem services. So can we use some of that to help with this situation and to safeguard against future pandemics? How can we empower the local people with the principle for the payment for environmental services?
Something that's dear to my heart. I'm very concerned with the COVID situation because I'm a great believer in the top-down approach to environmental law and Indigenous rights, that is international law, human rights law, environmental law, constitutional law, can lay down many of those fundamental principles and legal guarantees. But nothing is given, it's always fought for. So this is where I go back to my concept of environmental justice or just sustainability. You need to rethink what communities are and empower them to fight for what they want. And this is where education comes in again. If you go and take a microphone up to a very poor, very small community in a biosphere reserve and say, what do you want as a future for your community? They're probably not going to be able to say it immediately. They'll be probably more interested in how they feed their family. So it's a process to decide what your values are, your hierarchy of values, how you can express them as individuals, how you express them as a community. So we can't assume that these transformed communities are just going to occur overnight. It will be a process. So I think, and sometimes there'll be one step forward and two steps back. Our predecessors have made many, many mistakes. We therefore have to be, in a way, gentle and kind to communities as they begin this process, and they are concerned about feeding their family, and they are concerned with very immediate things. And sometimes they'll make good decisions and sometimes they'll make bad decisions, but they'll be more likely to address sustainability if we meet the basic needs that they have. And this is again where we get to the concept of just sustainability and how do we create livelihoods around sustainability transformations. So a fundamental part of that, and we've seen this with climate change and carbon trading, is one approach is how do we fund it and how do we create value? I happen to think we got lost in that discourse by making it too internationally state-centred and too legally complicated. I think what will work in the post-COVID world is that we need locally based livelihoods, locally based natural resource management, food security. Therefore, how do we develop livelihoods around it that are consistent with the Biodiversity Convention and our zonation in Biosphere Reserves? We actually have a workforce that we've been looking for, and it has all of these human rights, socially just aspects that we can meet as well. So it's a cross-section of social justice, human rights, and environment. The big issue is in countries like mine, most of these services have been performed pro bono. You take joint management of protected areas. Most of those people, unless they're rangers, are not paid. Their traditional knowledge is used without any recompense or very many safeguards. In developing countries, they're often paid very little. I still haven't got over the fact that when I did some work for the ADB in the 1980s, one of the world's best environmental lawyers was a Filipino environmental lawyer who was paid quite differently to me. And
So
that's very much what has happened. And it's happened under the Biodiversity Convention in developing countries. So that's an issue, whether it's a developed or a developing country. And it's an issue of equity that we have to continue to address. But a simple system that could develop is simply, you have to find the funding for ecosystem services. We've done a lot of work on how you develop livelihoods around those ecosystem services. The World Bank, ADB, IUCN, UNESCO, you know, your work on water, I'm sure, is focused on that to a great extent. So the question is, where do we get the money? Okay, so one way is to set up an elaborate trading system, subsidies, taxes. Taxes generally have a bad name. But most of the ecosystem services methods have been funded through very small, very broadly distributed fundraising mechanisms. We won't call it a tax, we'll call it a fundraising mechanism. It can be a levy on fuel. It can be a levy on anything that uses a fossil fuel. So long as it's broadly distributed throughout the economy, there are very few transaction costs in collecting it, and there's a strong social consensus that it's appropriate. Then what you do with the eco-services economy, and you know, Costa Rica and Brazil are very good examples of how this has been used, particularly in the forestry area, is you work out what are the drivers for environmental degradation, ecosystem degradation, and then you create value in ecosystem services and livelihoods around reversing those drivers or managing those values. And again, I think we've learned a lot of really good lessons in biosphere reserves and World Heritage areas. So what they did in Costa Rica is they worked out how much people were getting, particularly poor marginalised communities, from cutting down forests. Then they used their eco-services fund as a mechanism like microfinance to create marginally better and more consistent livelihoods, because once you cut down the forest, you degrade the soil, and you probably only have a few good years of farming. If you have a 20-year livelihood around managing the forest for its World Heritage values, you simply have to set the fee for the ecosystem services as a little bit more than what they'd get for cutting down the trees. Now, that may not be entirely equitable, but it will achieve that outcome, and it will improve people's stake in the ecosystem.
Thank you, Professor Donna.
That they would gradually get better and better at those payments.
That's really good, maybe conclusion for us, that for just sustainability, payment for environmental ecosystem services can really be a way forward in the times of COVID involving all communities. So we are very, very happy and grateful for you to join us. Let me try to summarize for our viewers. Unfortunately, Professor Jashenko couldn't join us today, so we will have another session with him, and we will continue to follow up with you. So very importantly, today we have discussed with Professor Donna the issues related to environmental justice and how did it evolve all the way from 1970s to now. And that's where the concepts related to sustainable development goals are now also very, very important. UNESCO's work with Biosphere Reserves as models for sustainable development. So we have many of those areas covered today. And Professor Roman has joined, so I will try to summarize this, and then we will start with Roman as another session. This would be unusual for the first time that we will have one after the other. So colleagues, if you want to continue to join, please stay, because this would be even more interesting from the science point of view. So while we have dealt with the legal side. So let me quickly also try to go that indigenous part of our society and in the environments we live usually is not properly considered. And very important to learn from you, Donna, with your work in with the indigenous communities, that indigenous communities may not have the concept of time, the past, present, and future, and how do we bring it into our environmental justice in the implementation of the laws and in the understanding of the link with the environment. So we have to continue to build that indigenous knowledge if we have to make the just sustainability. Also, very importantly, we have the guiding principles like polluter pays principle, or we have these environmental ecosystem services related principles, the programs like Man and Biosphere program, World Heritage Sites where we have protected areas. But very importantly, the zonation concept, the core zone, the buffer zone, the transition zone, it needs to very carefully consider how do we bring the global principles to the national laws, and how do we link all the way to the communities. And very importantly, we should never forget the local indigenous knowledge and the indigenous communities and bring it in their context. Also, very importantly, we have learned today that the justice system, the governance system can be strengthened. Judges are very flexible, and Donna has trained many judges, and including those in Bangladesh. So there is a good body of knowledge which is there, the expert witness system. But that's where I came into the interest of law while I was an expert witness to the Environmental Defenders Office called on me, and that's where I went into this degree program. In my view, also, Donna, we need to have this link between the scientists and the lawyers very strongly on both sides. Lastly, today we have also discussed very importantly, what do we do in the time of COVID? And the payment for environmental ecosystem services, there is a very good chance for us to protect against these pandemics, but also provide the just sustainability, livelihoods to people in their own areas. And there may be many ways to fund such kind of environmental ecosystem services, and very importantly, the role which the local and indigenous communities can play. So maybe that can be a guidance we take from today, and this can be a recommendation to our policy colleagues in the Man and Biosphere program, as well as with the World Natural Heritage. So we thank you, Donna, for today's wonderful session with us. Thank you very much. So now, with your permission, Donna, we start with the Roman. So Roman, sorry, there must be some confusion. How are you today?
Excellent, thank you very much. There is some confusion on the date, on the time, because I expected that in Almaty time it should be in 1 p.m., but it's in 11. I'm sorry for joining so late. But,
no problem. Let's see if there still colleagues are there. There are more than 100 colleagues who are still as participants. There are many colleagues who are on Facebook Live. This will be very unusual. I wanted to keep these sessions 30-40 minutes. But today we make a very special exception for Roman because you join us from Almaty, from Kazakhstan, and we have messed up somewhere the time. So welcome. Roman is a great friend for many years. And the work which Donna has described today on the Biosphere Reserves was an idea we discussed, Roman, if you remember, in 2014 in Syamari, when
yes.
we met there. And you said we must look into these donations and harmonization of laws and how can we guide the MAB ICC. From Seville, we went to Lima, and that then went into the work which Donna has done. And those reports are available, by the way, now, and the best practices. So Roman is Director General of the Institute of Zoology and the Chairman of Kazakhstan National Commission for UNESCO's Man and Biosphere program. And he is now also part of the international ICC. As I understand, Roman, from this year, you are part of the ICC, right? MAB ICC.
Yes.
Okay.
From this year.
Okay.
Yes.
So you missed a little bit of our discussion, but you wanted to have this harmonization of laws. but we need to have very strong scientific evidence.
Yes.
And that's where the expert witness comes. We may, if Donna will be still around, we can have a bit of dialogue between two of you as well. So, Roman, can you give us an idea with your work in Kazakhstan, with the Biosphere Reserves, with the big challenges of biodiversity, and you have many of Biosphere Reserves there, some of them are transboundary as well. What kind of scientific data is being collected and how it helps with the big challenges for Biosphere Reserves as the models for sustainable development? Over to you, Roman.
Yeah, I would like to talk from my side as a Kazakhstan citizen.
Yeah, please, please.
Yes, I can say that the Republic of Kazakhstan, like other countries, has a lot of international obligations related to the problems of environmental conservation and biodiversity conservation. These are primarily commitments to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and other global agreements, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity in Rio de Janeiro, the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals, and other conventions. So, in order to meet these obligations, each country provides scientific research on the state of natural ecosystems, assess the state of biodiversity, and also works to identify the main threats and suggest ways to reduce risks for both wild natural complexes and individual species of plants and animals. In the future, based on this data, measures are planned and implemented to preserve natural ecosystems, both at the national and international level. And so I think that data obtained from the various scientific organizations are used in the preparation of various national reports that are sent to the secretariats of high-level international conventions and agreements. So, for example, recently in last year, the government of Kazakhstan, for example, sent the 6th national report on the biological diversity in the Republic of Kazakhstan, the Secretariat of Convention. It was prepared in accordance with the guidelines for the 6th national report development prepared by the Secretariat. So, and my Institute of Zoology of the Republic of Kazakhstan provides information on current state of various species of animals, including rare and threatened species. The Institute of Zoology, being the national scientific organ for CITES in the Republic of Kazakhstan, is empowered to provide scientific information to the process of issuing permits for import and export of species of wild animals. They're parts of derivatives and includes in Annex 1, 2, and 3 to the CITES Convention, which are also an invasive alien species information and control mechanisms. The Governmental CITES Management Authority in Kazakhstan is Committee for Forestry and Wildlife under the Ministry of Ecology, Geology, and Natural Resources. But scientific confirmation should be done from our institute. And this is a big work. And for example, in last year, more than 200.5 permits for import and export of species, their parts of derivatives, were issued under the CITES Convention. So I can say that the number of permits increasing from year to year. For example, in 2014, it was only 194 permits. But in 2016, for example, it's about 200. And in this year, in last year, it's more than 200.5. So the purpose of the specimen import or export are commercial operation and scientific research and mobile exhibitions and so on. And at the moment, the impact of alien species also in wild ecosystem in Kazakhstan is hardly studied, and no attention is paid to this issue. But invasive alien species are known to disturb the biological balance once they are introduced in a natural ecosystem. In order to take adequate measures to prevent the negative impact of invasive alien species on an ecosystem, it is essential to determine when the invasive species appeared and what area it inhabits. Alien species invasion is one of the most important areas of fundamental and applied research and is the primary aspects for countries' environmental safety. To some extent, accidental colonization of species of new for the species areas and ecosystem is a natural process. However, human activity promotes its intensity. The expert of the Institute of Zoology raised the question of the need to create a black book of the fauna of Kazakhstan. Unfortunately, currently Kazakhstan lacks a system of early detection of invasive alien species introduction, event, and their destruction. So this idea on the black book is opposite idea for red data book.
Okay. So that's a very good introduction, that there is so much work which is going on in Kazakhstan.
Yes.
For identifying the species, for understanding the overall ecology, and you have also very importantly mentioned the missing gaps, especially for the alien species and the blacklist which you are going to produce. So this is a lot of hard work, and this hard work has to underpin the work of the conservation, but also sustainable development where it can take place or not. One important thing about Kazakhstan is you have many biosphere reserves, Roman. As a scientist, can you please give us an idea about those biosphere reserves? How people take them locally? Is it a matter of pride to have a biosphere reserve? You also have some biosphere reserves which are transboundary. How does it help promote cooperation between countries? So if you can give your experience on those areas in the concept of biosphere reserves in Kazakhstan.
Yeah, in Kazakhstan now we have 10 biosphere reserves, and first Korgaljan Biosphere Reserve was designated in 2012. So during these years we could prepare proposals for designation of 10 biosphere reserve. It's approved by UNESCO for this moment. But at the same time, we sent already in last year to another our proposals for another 2 biosphere reserves. And in this year also, we are preparing new proposals. So I hope in until the 2025, we will have about 20 biosphere reserves. So at the same time, we could create the first in Asia transboundary biosphere reserve in Altai region, in Altai mountain area. So we call this Great Altai Transboundary Biosphere Reserve. It was established under the agreement between Kazakhstan and Russia. It was signed by our presidents in 2011. So and after several years of hard work, we could send proposal to UNESCO for approval. And UNESCO approved this transboundary biosphere reserve first in Asia in 2017. So this is a very good achievement in our work, and this is very good mechanism for sustainable development in this area, because 2 different national teams work together in collaboration in the same methodical base for counting of species of animals, and also for attraction of tourists and for monitoring of ecosystems and monitoring of the economic activities in the transition area, and many, many others.
That's really excellent. So maybe if I can ask your insight, what is the reason for success? You have 10 biosphere reserves already, Roman, and you are going to go to 20, and you are already on this transboundary biosphere reserve. Is it like a champion like you, Professor Roman? What is the reason for success? Why there is a lot of interest, which is very positive thing. So what is the recipe for success for designating and managing these biosphere reserves in Kazakhstan, which we can learn from you?
Yeah, first of all, I can say why our governmental agencies and why people attract attention to the Biosphere Reserve models. It's because Biosphere Reserve not only a protected area, this is model area for sustainable development, because there is a special zone. This is transition zone for economic development in accordance with the harmonization with the nature. So in this case, people like this idea, and in this case, we also try to develop this program in Kazakhstan. So this is the reason why we are working hardly and try to promote MAP program in our region.
If I'm correct, Roman, it's not just the conservation.
Yes.
It's the concept of sustainable development. And
Exactly.
that's where Donna has introduced today just sustainability, making sure everyone is engaged and there's social, environmental, and economic aspect. Biosphere Reserves as models for sustainable development.
Exactly.
That's one of the reasons. If we can take a little bit more into your insight of this cooperation between on the Altai Biosphere Reserve, the transboundary cooperation. There must be some areas of harmony which needs because of the different laws across the boundary, or the laws are very similar already?
Russia and Kazakhstan has the common roots from the Soviet Union. In this case, legislation is rather, say, common. And in this case, we had no problems for organization of the transboundary biosphere reserve. But of course, we have some difference, especially national law on protected areas. But we could avoid all of these problems and could establish a very good relationship between two national systems of protected areas in this area. But I think we should continue our studying on the comparative analysis of legislation within the states in our region, but not, of course, in our region, in whole Asia. And as you remember, in Syamari, I proposed the idea to provide big project on comparative analysis of ecological legislation between several countries, at least 10, 15 countries. The first step was done, and it was a great and good project led by Professor Craig. Yeah, but it was only on the comparative analysis of the nation of Biosphere Reserve. Yeah. But we would like to continue these ideas and provide comparative analysis on whole aspects of Biosphere Reserves, even with analysis in some other laws, not only on protected areas, but also, for example, law on protection of animal world, law on the protection of plants, and many, many others. So, and I hope in future we can do it together within the international team. At least from Kazakhstan, we have some specialists who can do it.
No, this is really wonderful, and that was the benefit of our meeting we had in a long way, about 6 years ago in Syamari. And we came up with some other concepts like eco-labeling for livelihoods. We came up with best practices for managing different zones. And this is one of those areas. Maybe at this stage, Donna, would you like to also comment on Roman's observation that maybe some studies have been done on the legal aspects, but maybe more needs to also go on the transboundary side, where you see this work which we have done under Japan Fund's interest can take us forward?
Well, like Kazakhstan, in a way, was the outstanding model for national laws that we looked at. It was about the only example in the five country studies that we did where there was a clear framework for designating and the governance of biosphere reserves. But obviously that was built upon good practice, experience, and a strong social consensus. I don't think you can purely look at legal frameworks. In Australia, where we have biosphere reserves, World Heritage Areas, protected areas in Uluru and Kakadu, we have very, very strong legal frameworks for those particular places. But over the last few months, the arrangement has broken down completely. And so that in Kakadu, the management board has voted basically no confidence in the Parks Agency for whatever reason. I'm not completely across it. So, you know, strong legal frameworks, you know, are simply a part of the governance arrangements. And, you know, where you get countries where the legal arrangements reflect long-standing good practice and governance, they're more likely to be effective. In countries like Japan, where guidelines, administrative processes are very compelling and well adhered to, the legal framework may be less important. So this is, I guess, the importance of those comparative approaches. Is it different if you're dealing with First Nations, like an Indigenous community, in terms of your Biosphere Reserve? Is it different if you're in a unitary system rather than a federalist system? Is it different in a place like the Pacific Islands, where you might have constitutional recognition of customary law and plural legal system? So
we have still many
yeah, when you think of what laws and governance approach work, when and how, that's the essence of the kind of comparative study that I think you and Professor Jashenko are talking about. And the case studies that we did began to delve into that a lot more. Where you have fundamental problems with the enforcement of law and the rule of law, you will not probably have good governance and enforcement in biosphere.
So that's where the work is not finished yet, as Professor Roman has mentioned, and you have given ideas, Donna, that we need to look into all those local contexts also. So that's where Professor Roman's suggestion to take about 15 or more countries and continue this work, that may be something we need to continue to take forward. So I just wanted to get this view from both of you, that maybe this is an area where we should bring both the natural scientists, the environmental law people, the colleagues who are more into integrative sustainability, because of the concept of biosphere reserves as a model for sustainable development, and continue to publish. So we have to still publish your study as well as what has come more, and we have to continue to work. So Roman, in the interest of time, because we have stretched ourselves today into longer time, I have to ask you two more questions. And one of those questions is related to COVID-19, the present situation. And we had recently a seminar on answers are in water, and we had one of the UNESCO chairs from Kazakhstan also joining. And we learned the population density is not so high, but the actual challenge from COVID is quite high. What can be the role for the Biosphere Reserve? And Donna today has spoken also about the ecosystem services concept as well. What can we do as the scientific community working on biosphere reserves during these challenging times?
It's an interesting question. And yesterday we discussed this within our webinar in Russian language, within the Russian community. And I can say that pandemic, this COVID-19, seriously affected the organization of human society, which began to build its activity in condition of forced isolation. Of course, the restriction of human movement allowed the wild to regain its position. For example, in the vicinity of the megapolis of Almaty, researchers of the Institute of Zoology began to capture on photo and video cameras some rare species of wild animals, such as snow leopards, bears, and etc. So in this case, I can say that pandemic plays a very good role for rearing of the natural complexes. But at the same time, we should construct our activity in new conditions. So, and in this in this condition, organization companies began to build their work on the basis of remote regime of work. In this regard, the role of IT technologies has increased. As you know, the management is an information process, and the action on the control object occurs for transmitting information directly or indirectly to prompt action. Therefore, one of the ways to improve the management efficiency is to increase the speed of information transmission and increase the number of objects of information impact. In the new post-COVID-19 conditions, this is provided by the increased role of internet technologies and the use of cloud services. To work of many companies, including the Biosphere Reserve and other environmental organizations, has become based on communication electronic networks such as WhatsApp, Viber, WeChat, Telegram, and others. It has become a common practice to hold online meetings or conferences or seminars based on communication electronic platforms like Zoom, Microsoft Teams, Skype, WeChat, and others. So as well as conduct online interviews and training using electronic services for recruiting staff, creating thematic networks, regional offices, and so on. The rapid dissemination of information through the development of websites based on the latest technology solution, as well as the creation or development of electronic databases for general and limited use, text and images, videos, and audio, has become one important role in the activities of scientific organization and biosphere reserves. Everywhere, environmental organizations have begun to use QR code to promote additional information posted on their websites or in various cloud services. In Kazakhstan, Biosphere Reserve, it has become widely practiced to create or fill an online database for monitoring wildlife ecosystem status, of course, based on the reserve's website. And we have some very good examples on this. For example, the website birds.kz. So in this website, people, tourists, scientists could place the information about meeting of some rare species. Photos, the geographic position of such phenomena of meetings, and so on. And I think the Biosphere Reserve in nearest future will use the same practice in their work.
Yeah. So this is an interesting time. So certainly, Professor Roman, we are learning as we are going through it. And the integration of information technology tools into the conservation work and the way we are disseminating information is becoming more and more important. My last question, what would you advise us on our Japan Fund's interest and other similar programs? Given the present situation, where should we go from here? So one idea we've heard from you, a very good one. Let's expand the work on comparative law, understanding of the different instruments in different national settings, and Donna in those. So this can certainly be one area. What else can we do more as UNESCO, I would say, intellectual family, bringing all these aspects together where UNESCO's mandate is? Roman.
I think we should use UNESCO approaches for sustainable development. And of course, the MA program, the World Heritage approaches, and geoparks have a big potential for development. And this is very good mechanism for sustainable development. So, and our role of Kazakhstan National MAP Committee is to promote such programs in Kazakhstan. And we try to, to distribute these ideas among the society and among the governmental agencies and attract attention to these approaches. And I think we can use through the UNESCO ideology, we can use the intellectual achievements on the whole humankind. So, and, for us, this is very important.
So thank you very much. So the role for UNESCO in this COVID time to bring these intellectual ideas together so that we can move forward with confidence,
Yes.
with the evidence base for the environmental justice. That's very critical. That's all the time we have. So let me try to quickly summarize. First of all, I'm thankful to both professors, great source of inspiration for UNESCO. And for me personally, Professor Roman has given so many ideas today, as usual, and started this legal studies, which Donna has done a great job in bringing all those aspects together. So we have learned from Donna today the just sustainability concept, which really is to make sure the social, economic, environmental aspects come together and there is a proper recognition of the indigenous knowledge. And then Roman has given us very, very key ideas that we should be working together to collect the evidence. The scientific data is necessary. Kazakhstan is a great example where we have been working on the related ecosystems and also for the alien species, the blacklist which has been introduced by Roman. And the biosphere reserves, already 10 of them, maybe there would be 20 or more. So congratulations to Kazakhstan. It's possible only because the evidence base is there. Also, Altai Biosphere Reserve between Kazakhstan and Russia. And very good to learn that there are laws which can help harmonize these different aspects of conservation and sustainable development. And the concept of biosphere reserve is more attractive to the national government and to the local people living in those biosphere reserves because they are the models for sustainable development. Then we have also learned today concepts of payment for ecosystem services. At the same time, we also bring the IT in the times of COVID into our knowledge, information, and dissemination processes. We need to continue this work. The body of knowledge is growing, which can help educate the colleagues in their regions, in their countries. One thing I did not discuss today, and it should be evident, we have Professor Donna coming from the university background, as well as Professor Roman Jashenko with the academic interest, and he has been linked with many UNESCO chairs as well. So we need to have strong academia, government, local people, and of course businesses, interaction together to work together. And also the justice system in which judges play a very important role. They are very amenable to such ideas. They learn very quickly. This came through Donna's ideas. So we thank you both for making it very clear to us the concept of environmental justice, the evidence based from the ecological biodiversity, all the way to how people work and find their livelihood. And in this whole, the global principles can play a very important role as we move forward in these difficult COVID times. There is hope there, and there may be new ways for financing ecosystem services. With that, thank you to both of you. And we thank all those colleagues who have been continuing beyond the time normally we have. And we will continue to follow up. The reports which have been mentioned will be shared on our website. And all those questions, which quite a few of them are there, we will request Professor Donna and Professor Roman to answer for you. So, and we will put them with their proper origin from where the question came and who has answered them, and you will be able to network together. Thank you, Professor Donna, and thank you, Professor Roman. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for sharing, as usual, your ideas in the most generous way. Thank you. Sachi, over to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Donna, Professor Roman, and Professor Shahbaz, and all participants really stayed with us together until the end. And sorry for the confusion and the change of the webinar settings. We appreciate for your participation until now. If you wish to receive the certificate, please go to the link at the chat box and answer a few questions. We keep this form open 1 hour from now. Please don't miss the upcoming MFIT Sustainability Insight Part 10 on 3rd August, Sustainability Partnerships Through a Business Lens in New Normal. For further information, please visit our Sustainability Insight Facebook page and Instagram. We wish you a good day, stay safe, and see you all at our next event. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Have
you.
a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.